All right. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, I guess it still is if you're in the Seattle area on the West Coast. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever else you are in the world today. Thank you for tuning in and joining us at the Museum of Flight. My name is Cale Wilcox. I am the Public Engagement Manager at the Museum of Flight. We are still bringing you our public programs safe and sound from the comfort of your own home. The virtual programming continues as we continue to safely work our way through the current health pandemic situation. I'm very happy to have you all with us here today. We have a very special guest that I am excited to introduce you to. Throughout the course of our conversation today, if you have any questions that you would like to pose to our speaker, go ahead and enter them into the chat there on YouTube where you're watching the live stream. We can see those questions on our end, and we will do our best to get to them as we work our way through the conversation. Thank you so much again, all of you, for joining us. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today. Kellie Gerardi is an aerospace and defense professional and popular science communicator. Kellie has flown multiple parabolic research campaigns to evaluate commercial spacesuits and conduct bioastronautics research in microgravity with Project Possum, an acclaimed suborbital research group. Kellie's work to promote citizen science and inspire women in STEM has been featured across a broad range of media and has attracted hundreds of thousands of fans on social media. Kellie has worked with a number of commercial spaceflight companies and government agencies. She serves on the Defense Council for the Truman National Security Project and is a director of the Explorers Club, whose esteemed flag she carried during a crew rotation at the Mars Desert Research Station. Kellie currently lives in Jupiter, Florida, with her husband, Stephen, and their daughter, Delta V. Not necessarily rocket science, a beginner's guide to life in the space age is her first book, and it was an Amazon #1 new release across science categories. Kellie's non-traditional path in the space industry shows us that humanity's next giant leap will require the contribution of artists, engineers, and everyone in between. In her book, Kellie takes us on a tour of this unique window in history and offers an inside look into the commercial spaceflight industry and all those working to democratize access to space and tee up a golden age of spaceflight for scientists, students, and tourists alike. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome to our live stream today, author Kellie Gerardi. Hello, Kellie.
Hey, Cale, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being here with us. It's great to have you. Where are you joining us from today?
Sunny Jupiter, Florida. And I'm going to give the same caveat that I gave to you backstage for anyone listening. I got a wisdom tooth extracted 1 week ago, so I am in recovery mode. But if I sound a little slower at points, that's why.
Well, thanks for hanging in there, and thanks for being with us today. Hope you have a speedy recovery from that. So I read the book. I'll hold it up again here so everybody can see it. It is a great read.
Thank you.
It is interesting. It is at times humorous. It's very insightful. I wanted to ask you some questions about the book, about your career, about your views on space. Starting out, a central theme in the book is this constant thread, and through the arc of your career as well, this sense of unbridled enthusiasm for space exploration and the advancement of humanity through the cosmos. Tell us a little bit of what were your life experiences that introduced you to space?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I think about why was it that it didn't occur to me until after college in a completely unrelated degree that I could be a part of the space industry, it was not for lack of exposure. I mean, I grew up here in Jupiter, Florida, and really had front row seats to the final frontier. I could see space shuttles launching from my bedroom window that faced like northeast right over Cape Canaveral. And so, you know, I was aware that the space industry was happening, that there were people working and living and traveling to space. It was the background of my adolescence. I think the disconnect was not realizing until much later that I could be a part of that. It just seemed like, you know, a cool byproduct of being alive in the 21st century, that these extraordinary people got to go and do those things. And so as I got a little bit older and got a different kind of exposure, meeting people who didn't exactly fit the model of what I thought of when I thought of, the fighter pilot turned astronaut, which was, my mental framework for a long time, meeting people who were on the commercial side of space exploration, for example, just opened the floodgates of my own imagination and allowed me to think, wow, there's an entire industry underpinning these exceptional individuals, and maybe I can contribute to that. And then slowly over the next few years, that changed to, wow, maybe I can even go myself one day. There's more than one route to space. And so I think really harnessing that enthusiasm, that drive, and that excitement for space allowed me to think about, how can I bring other people along for this ride? How can I share that same blueprint to show others not to put a limiter on your own aspirations in something like the space industry?
Well, the enthusiasm certainly carries through in the book. Just for reference, what was that unrelated field that you studied in college?
I have a film degree, so very, about as far as you can get from aerospace and defense. But I will say that I do credit it with allowing me to create a different kind of impact in the industry and, bring a unique perspective to a lot of different situations.
For sure. And that kind of leads me into the next question here. How has navigating the commercial space industry as a non-engineer influenced your perception of the importance of STEAM versus STEM? And if you could describe what those two acronyms are for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So STEAM introduces the A in STEM, which is arts, science, technology, engineering, math, and it is encompassing of arts as an equally important part of all of these other disciplines. And, when I wrote Not Necessarily Rocket Science, it was because I was reflecting on the Renaissance, which, if you'll bear with me for this analogy, I'll just super quickly explain that. But in the introduction to my book, I was drawing the comparison that the Renaissance, during that time, art was only one manifestation of this new way of thinking, but cultural innovation was also happening across all of these wildly different disciplines of medicine, technology, religion, politics, science, even warfare. And similarly, I was drawing the, analogy that right now in the space age, engineering just represents one small slice of that innovation, but that this too is a cultural moment and a cultural movement. And like you so kindly shared in the intro when you were introducing me, it will require the contributions of artists, engineers, and everyone in between. And so that's really the lens that I was looking at STEM and STEAM through, and what inspired me to try to put pen to paper on a lot of those themes.
There's a line in the book where you say that the future of space exploration has to represent humanity as a whole, and not just, I'm paraphrasing here, but not just a certain subset of, say the square-jawed test pilot, but it'll have to be, a cross-section of all of us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, if you think about it, right, we have architects who will design the next generation of space habitats and space stations. We also need to have designers who will turn those into homes away from Earth. For every scientist, we need the educators, we need journalists who can report, we need all of these different functions, skill sets, perspectives to help shape, that next giant leap. And so I do think it is a huge, all-encompassing need for these diverse skills and perspectives.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a role in there for everybody. So 2020 and now into 2021 has been a pretty challenging time for our little spaceship Earth here. Have recent events made you think any differently about the responsibilities of the space industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, 2020 just sharpened the lens for everyone, I hope, right? I think the reality as it relates specifically to the space industry, what it drove home for me was that, the contrast and the emotional dissonance between exhilarating space achievements and devastating earthly happenings is only going to increase as this decade unfolds. And we in the industry all know that space exploration is critical and that it's not mutually exclusive to all of the problems that require and deserve attention on Earth. But I do believe we need to do a better job of preparing the public to grapple with that dissonance, because it's only going to increase. And we also need to hold ourselves accountable for being agents of change. Like the other, crisis outside of our health crisis is, confronting bias, both overt and implicit. And that's a societal plague for which, from which the space industry is not immune, right? And so now more than ever, I think we need to realize that we can never exist as an industry independent of what is happening in society, and, take active roles of having agency to be solution seekers in that and to set examples. It's like, this is an industry that is so high tech, so high stakes, that having any one single demographic who is sort of steering the entirety of Spaceship Earth can't happen, right? And so I think it's when we're talking about these themes, that what we're really talking about is the future of humanity. And so we do need to make sure that our industry, well reflects humanity if we want to earn the public's trust to go out and help create that future.
Yeah, absolutely. In the intro, I mentioned your work at the Mars Desert Research Station, and part of the experience of 2020 and into now, that sense of isolation through quarantine and lockdown. I imagine there's a little bit of parallels there to maybe long distance space travel and all the preparation that goes into that. Though I imagine on a Mars mission, at least you have an idea of when when the isolation will end, as opposed to what we're going through now with the pandemic.
Yeah.
You spoke a little bit about bias within the industry just now. In your book, you write about some of the additional challenges that are put upon women in the space industry, both historically and in current times. What advice would you have for young women who may have to prepare to navigate sexism in a professional career?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, I think there were sort of like two independent things that I was battling. One was just this all-encompassing belief that this industry wasn't an obvious fit for me. And, half of that calculation was looking at, there aren't a lot of people who, look like me. This was 10 years ago when I was really just starting to try to break into the industry. And the other half was coming from an arts background, right? Like my path was very non-traditional. And so it was this feeling of disproportionate pressure. Like I felt like I had to work twice as hard just to prove myself. And, this enormous pressure of, if I mess up, somehow it doesn't feel like just a, reflection on me. It feels like a reflection on all non-engineers in the industry or all women in STEM, right? And so obviously that was not the case, but that was how it felt at times. And so to that first part of not seeing a lot of people who looked like me, I do remember being extremely self-conscious in the beginning, and I could kick myself for it. But it was, being overly concerned with how I might be perceived and actively trying to tone things down, whether it was makeup or the way I dressed or the way that I, just conducted myself to try to tone those things down in the hopes that people might take me more seriously, or the way that I thought I should be perceived because of it. And so the advice that I would give to that specifically is, it took a long time, but just being willing to embrace your multitudes and, reject the notion that any aspect of, femininity in that case is frivolous. That's something that's really important to do. And, coming to terms with looking my best, feeling my best, all of these things gives me my confidence to do my best. I doubled down on that unapologetically over time. And I think that was a message that over the years has resonated with a lot of folks who, have helped me create this community online that I am so grateful for, and the science communication platform. I think it's a message that, resonates with a lot of people.
Absolutely. Speaking of confidence, another theme in your book there is this kind of unflagging commitment you seem to have to just putting yourself out there and really pursuing relationships with potential mentors, or just being present in a lot of different situations. How much importance can you put on that sense of confidence when it comes to achieving your goals or being the person you want to be?
Yeah, it's a mindset switch. It's like, I think a lot of times the lines get blurred between outsider and imposter. And in the beginning of my career, I was, holding myself back because I felt like an imposter in this industry, when in fact what I was just an outsider who was still trying to get into the industry. Because to consider myself an imposter would mean that I don't deserve to be a part of that industry, even after putting work in. I don't belong. Being an outsider simply meant I had work to do still and learning to do, and that continues even to this day. But I think the confidence piece is, it has to come from within. It has to be genuine, and you have to believe that you are the only one who can architect that blueprint for your next steps. And if you're not going to do it, it's not going to happen. And so for me, it was looking around. It was exposure to a lot of different types of people in the industry that helped bolster my own confidence that there is a role that I can play. There is an impact that I can have. There's a value I can generate for this industry. I can be a part of this. And so I think it really is important to have that confidence that you have something to offer to whatever industry you're trying to be a part of, and then to unapologetically sort of seek out opportunities to prove that and to learn. Obviously, I think the biggest part of that is approaching it with humility. There's also a fine line between confidence and arrogance. And, would recommend to stay away from the latter at all costs, because I think everyone still has something to learn, no matter what stage of their career they're in.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, that's fantastic advice. You speak often about how diversity, equity, and inclusion aren't just niceties, they're necessities for success. How would you describe the necessity of DEI for the space industry in particular?
Yeah, so my career has exposed me to equal parts aerospace and defense, right? And so after a decade of these whiteboards and war rooms, I have learned that the people designing technology hold the power to decide how it's applied, basically. And like we discussed earlier, in a high-tech, high-stakes environment like aerospace and defense, it's in everyone's best interest to cultivate the broadest possible set of perspectives and novel approaches to the complex problems of tomorrow. And to me, that's the best definition of diversity, And I think where some people get tripped up is the difference between lowering the barriers and lowering the bar. And so when we talk about, diversity, equity, and inclusion, when I speak about it, what I'm speaking about is lowering the barriers to access, never lowering the bar. And, we as a space industry should know better than anyone, as we all try to democratize access to space and lower the barriers quite literally to orbit, that it's the same logic that applies to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want more talent to be able to contribute to this industry. And so I think we have a long way to go. But we've also come a long way, and it's really encouraging. And so I think, there's a lot of granular things that we could do better when it comes down to the company level, right? It's attracting the right talent to your organization. Do you have parental leave policies in place? Things like that when you're trying to earn the trust of the world to engineer this future. Let's make sure we can really credibly answer, who are we engineering this future for? What does that future look like?
Yeah, absolutely. We're coming up this month on the anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's first manned orbit of the Earth, first human spaceflight there. And you spoke a little bit about kind of how linked space flight and defense are. That anniversary makes me think of how much progress was made in space based around national defense in that era, right, during the Cold War. Can you speak a little bit about your feelings about how defense and how space are related, and where that puts us technologically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my personal view is that space is a domain equally worthy of attention and resources as, land, air, sea, cyber. I think some of our most critical assets are orbiting overhead. You consider wargaming out a day without space, right? It would cripple our economy. It would, our everyday tasks are dependent on these really, sensitive assets that are orbiting overhead that keep our society functional, that keep us safe, that power so many of the things that we take for granted. And so, I think, well, it's obviously a sensitive topic when we're talking about the difference between, the militarization of space versus weaponization in space, right? And I think, Space has been a militarized domain since the first days of Sputnik, lest anyone was, thinking that that was a purely exploratory effort. It was not. And so, as we consider these things and we consider, the national security implications of this domain, I do think it is critically important. I also think international cooperation is absolutely required. This is, now a domain that affects all human beings on planet Earth. And so we really are tasked now with creating an even more robust international framework to work within. The UN Outer Space Treaty was a good start. Decades old reasoning, lots of loopholes that could keep people awake at night, thinking about how technology has advanced now. These are things that, we need to keep up with as technology advances.
Yeah, ever working towards democratizing access to space, right?
Exactly.
And speaking of which, how do you think that spaceflight candidate profiles and qualifications will evolve? I think we've seen a little bit of that recently after the conclusion of the shuttle era.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, my personal bias in this is that I truly believe that suborbital spaceflight is the great equalizer, right? And how I look at it is in the entire history of humanity as a spacefaring species, right, from Yuri onwards, we have sent less than 1,000 humans to space. We are talking, in the grand scheme of things, handfuls, right? You think about a company like Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic, Virgin Galactic selling tickets, they could single-handedly in their first few years of operation double, triple the amount of humans who have ever been to space. And so it's a remarkable sort of, shift in the way we look at access to space, in the way we look at perspectives of folks who are coming back and experiencing this overview effect, and also who gets to go, right? We're not just talking, billionaires at this point. We are actively democratizing space access for researchers, for students, for scientists, and obviously for tourists as well. I also believe that space, like any new frontier, requires both patrons and pioneers. And so I do think tourism is a critical part of that and an important one to expanding Earth's economic sphere and to create the business case. And not to, drone on and on with this answer, but the one other thing that I would point out that I really love about the business case of suborbital spaceflight is baked into the suborbital business plan is this engineering of the most inclusive possible demographic for spaceflight, right? It's if you're approaching it with, who can you fly to space from the public? From the beginning, you're targeting a demographic who probably, is a little bit older than your average, NASA astronaut candidate, or they at least have a lengthier and more diverse medical history, perhaps, and so that represents a step order change in qualifications and access and, in a medical program to design around this business plan. And I think that, for a species who will eventually need to consider getting more and more humans, into space and developing that capability, I love championing, the business cases that endeavor to democratize access to space for the broadest possible set of humans.
Absolutely, and you kind of speak to a urgent need there. I believe in your book at one point you quote Stephen Hawking in a conversation you had with him. Can you relate that a little bit when he was explaining the necessity to get humans off the planet?
Yeah, a remarkable human, and probably the single person who I am just most grateful to have crossed paths with. And he was a very funny person as well. And so his analogy was that to not, leave planet Earth would be like being castaways on a desert island. And he also said that right now we have all of our eggs on one planet. And so he was continually pointing out the fact that, there is risk mitigation to be factored in, to all of humanity, where we have this single precious flame of life, and so I think it's something that I've always taken to heart as well. And I think we're so well on our way. If you look at just the past, couple months in the space industry, really, right? It's we are seeing different nations send emissaries for the first time. We're seeing astronaut representatives from different countries who are going to have a presence in space like never before. We're seeing civilian spaceflight, like Inspiration 4. That's crew profiles evolving. That it's a remarkable sort of watershed moment, I think, in access to space, and hopefully an indicator of what's to come.
I think of even just from the technological aspect, I remember clearly here what felt like not very long ago being absolutely riveted watching SpaceX land a first stage booster on a barge and just being completely mind blown by it. And now I think I read the other day that they just landed their 79th or something to that effect. And it's, do you feel like we're well on our way to that goal of making spaceflight boring? Like making it so routine that it's safe, that it doesn't stand out as much anymore?
Yeah, I think routine for sure. For me, I'm still someone who has a little catch in their breath every time a commercial aircraft takes off to the sky. And so I feel very confident saying I will never lose the magic, or the magic will never be lost for me in watching, a spacecraft leave Earth or a rocket take off. But I do think that we will, for my daughter's generation, my daughter's 3, I forget what they are, Generation Alpha, I think they're called now at that age, after Gen Z. But, I brought her to the SpaceX inaugural Falcon Heavy launch when she was a newborn. She was under 3 months old, and we, headed over to KSC, had Feel the Heat tickets right up as close as you can get. She had baby ear protection. And the multiple sonic booms that were experienced in that flight. I remember just as the sound barrier was breaking over my infant daughter's head, the thought that I had was an emotional one. It was like, oh my God, her generation, this is going to be the backdrop of her adolescence, the same way periodic shuttles were for mine, except tenfold, right? It's, to your point, I believe that it's going to be so routine that it's going to be just a natural occurrence, although I hope that we can still maintain a sense of appreciation for how hard even the seemingly easy stuff looks.
Well, and in terms of sharing that sense of appreciation, what are the tools and platforms that you use to share and promote science to a broad audience? What's the power of social media?
Yeah, it's huge. I feel so fortunate to just have been born at that intersection where these tools were coming online, like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of these things, just as I was exiting high school, thankfully. So I missed the window of like completely embarrassing myself and, got on at the point at which I had more refined thoughts to share with the world. But I have had the privilege of building a really large science communication platform, and it's on apps like Instagram and TikTok. Those are the two that I use the most. And I've also had the opportunity to take the conversation onto physical bookshelves with the release of my book, Not Necessarily Rocket Science, last year. And so those are the tools that I've used in science communication. And I think, again, the unique kind of credit to my film degree and sort of media and communications degree more broadly is that sharing my passion came really easily to me. It came naturally. In some ways, my lack of a traditional engineering degree actually amplified my space communication skills, because I naturally gravitated away from nitty-gritty technical concepts in favor of these big picture takeaways that had captivated me in the first place as an outsider, as a lay person. And so, taking those things that gripped my emotions and then trying to distill them down into themes that would resonate with the general public as well, I think was a skill set that I was able to cultivate and tap into. And look, I'm not a poet and I'm not a brilliant engineer, but I was an earnest space advocate and an active contributor over time to scientific research myself, and a natural communicator. And so in spreading awareness for that future that I felt like we could collectively unlock, I was hoping to motivate people to make the most of their life in a space age. And that became a whole lot easier with social media.
Yeah, we certainly have a swath of technological tools at our disposal these days to communicate, which is why it's always fun, though, to still see a physical book. I usually make a point to ask this to all of our authors, and since this is your first book, what made you decide to write a book, and what's that experience like? And also, was this a quarantine project for you, or did you start it before the pandemic?
I started it before, but it really, not having distractions and being at home allowed me to accelerate my writing process for sure, throughout 2020, the first part. Yeah, I wrote the book because once I reached, I have about 500,000 followers. And the question that I get asked most frequently, and by most frequently, I mean, this was 10 or 20 times a day prior to this book, was, how do I do what you do? How do I get involved? Or I'm a college student, I'm a high school student, I'm a middle schooler, I want to be a part of that. Or look, I'm a nurse, I'm an artist, I don't have a STEM degree like you, but how did you traverse over into the space industry? I just never thought I could be a part of that. How do I do it? And so my motivation in writing the book was to provide both part memoir and part handbook, really, and to show people this is exactly what I did. This is what my experience was while I was doing it. This is exactly who I spoke to, what companies I worked at, what it felt like, where I messed up, where I succeeded, and then here's why I did it. Here's the big themes that resonated with me. Here's why I care about space exploration. Here's what motivates me. And hopefully here's how you can do it yourself, or at least apply the same framework to whatever it is that is your dream to go be a part of.
Excellent. Well, it came together very well in the book. I'll make a quick plug. You can purchase Kellie's book through the Museum of Flight website. We are doing curbside pickup right now. If you're in the Seattle area, highly recommend you head over and check that out. Just kind of zooming out a little bit, Kellie, what's been the most rewarding and most challenging career experiences for you?
Yeah, I think most rewarding for me is connecting with people. It's like, I get emotional when I get messages sometimes on social media, because people will say that they've, either read my book, or they've been inspired by content and they've gone back to school, or they've applied for their dream job. They've put their hat in the ring for something that they didn't previously believe that they would be qualified for. They started science communication platforms of their own. They've just reached for their dreams. And I think that's been by far the most rewarding part of this, because that's sort of the compass that I was looking for when I first started out. And then I think the other part, personally, has been crossing paths with some of the people I admire most in the world. Stephen Hawking, who we spoke about, was one. It was a joy to know him, and I've shared this in just a handful of other talks that I've given. But the most poignant memory I have with him was just taking a minute to witness not just his brilliance, but his sense of humor and mischief. And, I remember I was at his 75th birthday party at his home, and you would not believe the diverse group of guests that were at that birthday party. I mean, it really just was, from A-list celebrities who anyone would recognize, to just the most esteemed academic community members who some might, but others, would rather their autograph, to everyone in between, from different disciplines, different walks of life, just everything. And to me, that just diverse group of friends really summed up a life well lived. And, he left his thumbprint on the whole world. And so I just remember thinking wow, humanity is really better off because of it. And it was a highlight of my career to bring a fine point of it, to contribute a short chapter to his and his daughter's Lucy's children's book, George and the Blue Moon, which is a wonderful children's series.
Awesome. And what about a challenging experience? What stands out in that regard?
Yeah, the challenging ones still continue. I talk a lot about how important it is to banish imposter syndrome, but I still combat that daily. I think I have a tendency also to minimize my successes and catastrophize my failures. I really try to stay present in it, because, I look at something like today, just to break the fourth wall here and be totally transparent. It's how freaking cool. I'm speaking at the Museum of Flight, right? This is if you had told me 10 years ago that I would have the opportunity to talk to an audience and be attached to such an esteemed organization of this, it's amazing. And yet today, you get in the mode right before talk and you're okay, I just can't mess up. That's the goal. And then afterwards, it's the checkbox mentality of okay, I did it. It was okay. I didn't fully embarrass myself, right? Without taking a moment to be wow, like this is so cool. Right. And so I do try to be better about that, because I do have such a tendency to, feel like I haven't accomplished enough, I haven't done enough, or minimize what I have done, and then, compare myself, to other people, which is just not a great way to live your life. And so I'm actively trying to just stay in the moment, be grateful for the opportunities, and, allow myself a sense of, okay, you did that. That's awesome.
Well, I appreciate the kind words about our institution, and to continue breaking the fourth wall. I also appreciate I'm not the only one who gets a little nervous before going live with these kind of things. You mentioned your interactions with Stephen Hawking and how you feel about him, and what kind of influence he had over you. Could you share any other stories about any other mentors you might have that inspired you?
Yeah, my go-to mentors and the people who have had the most profound influence on my life and career are Leticia and Richard Garriott-Caillot. Richard Garriott is a private astronaut. He was one of the, he was co-founder of Space Adventures first, and then flew himself as a private citizen to the International Space Station, and one of the first humans to do that privately. And he was my first introduction to the Explorers Club over a decade ago. I worked coat check at the Explorers Club. I was just so motivated to be around these people who I thought were just the coolest, and I still do think they're the coolest explorers in the world. And he was my first sort of aha moment that not every astronaut came through NASA, and that there are other paths to space. And that just totally flipped my understanding of what the definition of possible was, and made me look at things a little differently. He eventually was my him and his wife Leticia have been my mentors, but he was my sponsor into the Explorers Club as a member myself. And then this past year, even, that has continued in so far as I joined the board of directors of the Explorers Club, which is a very nice coat check to BOD arc that was fun to complete. And then Richard was just elected president of the Explorers Club this past week. And so it really has come full circle. But Leticia and Richard they're my personal advisory board. And I honestly think everyone should come up with a personal advisory board who can just be a sounding board to you on career decisions. I also think I want to take a minute to distinguish between mentors and sponsors, because the Garriotts have been both to me. I think a mentor is someone who, shows you what door would be best for you to walk through. And then a sponsor is someone who holds that door open for you. And, in that analogy, it was Richard and Leticia who have made recommendations to institutions that, oh, you should talk to Kellie, or Kellie would be a great fit. They've given me sort of endorsements, and in turn, I have done my best to make sure that their confidence was well placed.
Awesome. One of the fun things that I like about Richard Garriott, just as a quick aside here, I remember the generation before ours harping about how video games were never going to get you anywhere in life. And then you have somebody like Richard who went from video games to space tourist to hanging out on the International Space Station. So you never know. You never know where things are going to take you.
Exactly.
You've had experience in microgravity.
Yes.
That's incredible. That not a lot of people have. What were you doing there, and what sort of activities take place in microgravity for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is the most, I should have given that answer when you asked what are the highlights, because, aside from the things I mentioned, there is nothing quite like floating weightless. And it's something that I wish I could do all day long. But basically, during parabolic research flights, it's a modified aircraft that is flying here on Earth in airspace, but flying in a roller coaster profile in parabolas. And so on those sort of nose dives, over the crest, you can imagine this roller coaster profile. That's when you get that free fall, which is mimicking a microgravity environment. It's like an analog environment for space, basically. And the way I would describe the sensation of it is, if you can imagine floating in a pool and just sort of subtract the sensation of water beneath you, that is the serenity of floating in microgravity. I think some people obviously don't have as serene an experience. That's why the aircraft has been dubbed the vomit comet. I have never experienced anything other than joy in microgravity. So maybe I'm just built different. No, I'm kidding. I think some people just have more sensitive stomachs, and, it can be disorienting. But the research that I've done has been, a couple different things that have been really, really fun. So first, evaluating commercial spacesuits with Final Frontier Design. And so they've created a spacesuit that is an IVA spacesuit. So you think of EVAs, extravehicular activity outside a vehicle, IVA spacesuits designed and intended to be worn inside the vehicle for safety. And so evaluating sort of, how you can interact with a spacesuit on precise fine motor skills, being able to do human-tended payload research while navigating that in a spacesuit. It's cumbersome. And so being able to just collect data for them and evaluate the performance of a spacesuit in microgravity. And then separately, I have done a lot of other really fun research. I'll share my favorite one. Was actually, I swallowed a tiny experiment before one flight from the Canadian National Research Council, and it was a pill-shaped Bluetooth device that was designed to track my visceral core body temperature in flight. And so once it was digested, I was able to pair and unpair the pill in my stomach with a small handheld tablet, and I, was able to track vitals in real time. So for at least 15 minutes before the flight, that's what I was doing. Just pair, unpair, like congratulating myself for being born in the future. It was really, really fun. And for the next couple of days, I had to wear a bright yellow, no MRI bracelet. But yeah, I mean, that's the kind of research that is, that I've participated in microgravity. And it's really wonderful that we have access to an environment like that.
Yeah. How long does that weightlessness last on those parabolic arcs?
Yeah. So it's, that's why the promise of suborbital spaceflight is so exciting, because these are fleeting seconds, right? It's like, you can only free fall for so long before you hit the ground. And so you got to pull up really quick. So we're talking like, at the top, like 25 seconds of microgravity roughly, and then pulling up again when you're experiencing high G. And then repeat maybe 30 times over the course of a flight. And so, you're not getting the continuous microgravity, you're getting these bursts of 25 seconds at a time to, strap in, egress from your seat if it's physical experiments that you're doing, or set up the payload if it's not. And, you get only that time boxed amount times 30 different, parabolas perhaps.
What an exciting ride.
Exactly.
Speaking of analogs to spaceflight and space exploration, we've mentioned this a couple times now, but you took part in the Mars Desert Research Station. Could you talk a little bit about what the intention is behind that research station and what that experience was like?
Totally. So the Mars Desert Research Station, MDRS, is a prototype laboratory. It's in Utah's San Rafael Swell, which, millennia of iron oxide has colored red like Mars. So it really does it is remote. And it really looks as though you are on Mars. And so I think, that prototype laboratory is fascinating because it allows researchers to go conduct Mars research, basically, to live as though you might be an early settler on Mars. And so, since I think 2001 or roughly around there, a number of different space agencies and scientists have been able to utilize that facility as crews for multi-week simulations of deep space flight or life on Mars. And so my international research team consisted of 7 scientists from JAXA, NASA, and private industry. And it was a really diverse range of skill sets. There were trauma surgeons, there was a medevac pilot, there was a microbiologist. And together, it was immersing our crew in this multi-week simulation of life on Mars and doing it in 1,200 square feet of living space, which is the equivalent of a small 1-bedroom apartment, right, for 7 humans to live as though the outside will kill you. And so you're indoors all the time, except on planned EVAs. And I think the most interesting part about it was, we committed to the simulation and decided early on that we were going to try to have this be as high fidelity as possible. And that means, we were respecting the conditions of what you might expect on Mars. So we respected a time delay with Earth, no real-time communications, no social media, obviously no phone calls, no real-time comms, and also throttled bandwidth appropriately. No going outside unless it's a planned EVA. When you do go outside, it's in a tag team wearing a spacesuit. And again, I was able to evaluate actual spacesuits from Final Frontier Design as part of that crew mission. And so it was really fascinating. I think I took a lot of different lessons away from that. Resilience being one of them, for sure.
In your book, you talk about you and the crew deciding on what sort of emergencies would cause you to agree to break the simulation. You mentioned your wisdom tooth situation at the top here.
Yeah.
Emergency extraction tooth surgery, is that something that you'd want to undertake under the simulation, or is that something that you would go back to civilization for?
Yeah, I'll say this. The first thought I had an emergency wisdom tooth extraction. So it was, and meaning, I didn't know it needed to come out when I entered the dentist's office in pain the other day. And because it needed to come out as an emergency situation, I was not put under. So I was fully awake, fully conscious what was happening. It was just topical Novocaine, right? And so the first thought that went through my mind is, what if I was in space right now? Like, what if this was an emergency that required like telemedicine or something else? And I walked away with the conclusion that I could do it. Like, I didn't have to go under, as long as we had the right sort of topical anesthetic. I think like that's the big one. So on the MDRS, if we have Novocaine, I feel like we could have tried something. Without it, I probably would have been, raising my hand to break sim and, head to help. But it's fascinating to think about the implications of fields like telemedicine, right? Or cross training. That was the one other thing that I would say I walked away with, is like, to be an excellent astronaut, I learned you don't have to be an expert in one thing. You need to be a cross-trained generalist in a lot of things. You have to be capable in a ton. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to be an expert in all of them. And so, I just thought of the Heinlein quote, like, specialization is for insects. And, that really just was driven home in our crew. It's like, if you can have the aptitude and, train up in a couple of different disciplines and have a few subject matter experts to like round out that knowledge, that is really what you're going to hope for in a crew that needs to be self-reliant.
Absolutely. I imagine you had expectations about what the experience was going to be like going into the MDRS. What was maybe one thing that you weren't expecting that stands out to you as being maybe more challenging than you anticipated about living on top of each other and being in isolation like that?
Yeah, I think just driving home, we talked a little earlier about like crew profiles evolving. It's like, that was something that stood out to me. It's like, okay, if the sort of fighter pilot model was the right candidate for this like high octane orbit of the Earth, who is the right candidate to make a home out of a hostile environment? It's like, we have to start thinking a little more expansively about the profiles. And, we have to look towards crew qualifications with the lens of, compatibility, emotional intelligence, all of these sort of different skill sets that aren't always the like tactical check the box, skills. And so I think it's a really interesting thing, and emotional fortitude, right? We just don't know. We've never sent a human that far away from their species and their home planet. Psychologically, I think it'll be really interesting to understand who is best suited and compatible for a mission of that magnitude. And then I think also just the personal takeaway of like, I can do hard things, like almost immediately we experienced a total loss of power, fuel, communications, catastrophic losses, right? Which would be on par for early settlers of Mars. But, having no toilet, no refrigerator, no water pump working, no link to the outside world, and then having to like kickstart self-reliance and build field latrines and ration water and, create a generator out of a rover, which was our ATV, and try to relay with mission control. It's like, we were successful and we did it all in spacesuits. But it showed me that, like, the human ingenuity counts for a lot. And so when I think about the difference between purely robotic missions and the future of like humans going to space, it's like, that's what inspires me. It's like that sense of exploration, that sense of resilience and perseverance and all of those things. Like the earliest Mars, rover missions, Pathfinder, I do believe that they are pathfinders for eventual humans to explore.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'll remind our audience, we have just a few minutes left here in our time with Kellie today. If you have any questions for her, go ahead and enter them into the chat there on YouTube. I just have a couple more for you here, Kelly, and we'll keep an eye out to see if any audience questions come in. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us here today. It's been a fantastic conversation. So of all the exciting recent space news, both from private industry and from government programs, and I'm thinking, of course, obviously about the Perseverance rover and its little helicopter that are about to do their thing on Mars. But what recent advancement or upcoming milestone in space exploration has you the most excited right now?
Yeah, so I have three. Number one being Virgin Galactic's next test flight. I really feel so strongly that suborbital spaceflight is the game changer, and that's the needle that will move the biggest, broadest number of humans to space. And that's the paradigm shift that I feel like I've invested my career in for the last decade, is trying to make that future possible. And so I am most excited for this watershed moment, to keep using that phrase, but that's what I'm so excited for, because I feel like the implications are just so disproportionate to everything else. And I'm just so pumped about that, because that will signal, the next wave of like commercial operations for suborbital spaceflight, and, flights full of civilians going to space on a regular recurring basis. So that's number one. And it represents like the one I'm most excited about. I think next is the Artemis program, and NASA's flagship program to send the first woman, the first person of color, the next man to the moon. I think that is just another global sort of, stunning achievement of human ingenuity. And even, I don't think it takes away from the fact that we've already been there. It's been 50 years, like we are overdue to return. And so I think, I look at my, again, 3-year-old's daughter and think like, what does it mean to live through an Apollo moment, in her case, an Artemis moment, and also at the same time to see yourself reflected. I think that I get goosebumps when I think about that. And so Artemis, number two. And I think number three is this next wave of other civilian spaceflight, like Inspiration 4 is probably like the best example that comes top of mind right now. It's like, we are seeing and proving that, I think Elon Musk has said in the past, like, to ride Dragon, it's like, if you can ride the Hulk roller coaster, like, you are probably meeting the physical, requirements for, riding Dragon. And so I think proving that, civilians can earn their astronaut wings, that this is, there will always be a place for government astronauts who are going to do a job in space. But equally, we can show that civilians also have the right stuff in this next generation of space exploration. And so I think all of those three things together represent the things that I'm currently most excited about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and there's plenty to keep your eye on in modern times here. It seems like there's some new astounding headline every day.
Exactly.
You're talking about Artemis, and it made me want to ask you this question. There seems to be camps in terms of our next boot prints. Are you back to the moon, go straight to Mars, or some in between, like an asteroid fan? Or do you just want to see people out there anywhere exploring and discovering and learning?
Yeah, it's like I'm location agnostic. I think the one thing I want to see more than anything is like, I would love to not have just, flags and footprints as the mission, right? I would love to see sustained human presence somewhere, whether that's, a continuation of like more in low Earth orbit, and, an expansion of like our current space station model to include commercial space stations, more, emissaries from different nations, more civilian research opportunities, or whether that's sustained human presence on the moon in a lunar, settlement, or on Mars. It's like, for the next steps, location agnostic, I want to see it happen. I think that it all goes to this, collection of really important data that is required for our next giant leap. But beyond that, I want to see us continue to push the envelope and reach a little bit bigger for, continuous and sustainable presence in space.
Yeah, absolutely. Does it feel inevitable to you?
It does. It does, provided that we don't do anything to, compromise ourselves in the process, right? I think we're our own biggest risk to success. We both hold the keys to engineer or destroy our own future. And so it's always that delicate balance of like, we can have the Star Trek future. Are we able to give it to ourselves and work together? I mean, that's the secret sauce, right? It's not an American pursuit. It's not a Chinese pursuit or a Russian pursuit, right? It is a human pursuit at this particular point. And so if we can overcome some of those really nuanced, geopolitical tensions to create common goals for humanity, I think it only serves to benefit everyone on Earth.
Yes, and that's a good reality check to kind of encapsulate this very enthusiastic approach you have to space exploration. I'm not seeing any audience questions come in, so to wrap us up today, Kellie, just to kind of put you on the spot, what would you say is your inspirational tagline for Kellie Gerardi? What final thought would you want to share with, say, a younger generation that's trying to find their way into the space industry or just build their own enthusiasm for it?
Yeah, I would encourage them to just not let anyone put a ceiling on your dreams or your potential or your aspirations. It's like, if that door doesn't currently exist, consider that a temporary situation and either create your own. It's like, look, I get a lot of flack because I tell people, I look them in the eye and I tell them that I will be an astronaut. I am going to be an astronaut. And, I'm happy to receive a tidal wave of skepticism to that. That's fine. I have learned how to filter appropriately and block that negativity out of my life and continue on this track. It's like, I'm going to continue doing everything I can to make that reality possible for myself. And I intend to one day do that through suborbital spaceflight, because I have, given my career to helping lay the groundwork through whether it's policy and business development in the commercial space industry, and now through, human research in suborbital space. And so I think you have to go for what you want, and you have to believe that you're capable of it. And, if it happens, I'm not going to have a big, I told you so moment to anyone. And if it doesn't happen, it's not going to shake, my sense of self-worth, but it'll feel pretty validating if I make it happen.
Excellent. Well, it doesn't get much more inspirational than that. Kellie, thank you so much. We have her book here, Not Necessarily Rocket Science. It's a great read. Be sure to check it out. It is available through the Museum of Flight store. Kellie, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We greatly appreciate it at the Museum of Flight. I hope to have you back to share with us the experience of what suborbital spaceflight is like at some point in the future. But until then, we'll all keep our eye on all the cool things happening in space and with your own career. So with that, we'll go ahead and terminate today's program. Kellie, once again, thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for joining us today as well.
Thanks so much.
All right. Have a good weekend, everybody. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.